Hi everyone, Erin from the Impatient Gardener, and talk about being impatient. I'm standing here in the vegetable garden. As you can see, it's a little early to be thinking about actually planting something here, but it is definitely not too early to think about making a plan for how the vegetable garden is going to look and what I'm going to grow here this year. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. So first of all, you guys know the vegetable garden pretty well, and it's a raised bed garden. I'm a huge proponent of raised beds. I think they have so many advantages to them. You can make your own soil. It's easier to garden in a smaller space. I like mine because they're high. I made these beds 21 inches tall, which makes it very easy to work in them. I just love raised beds. For me, it is my preferred way of growing food and vegetables. One of the other things about raised beds is that I think it's even easier to make your garden beautiful. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, because I think we need to dispense with this notion that vegetable gardens are strictly about being productive gardens. There is no reason you cannot have a beautiful and productive space in the same area. And I actually think you're going to have a better garden for making some of these changes. So I'm partnering with Junk Seed on a series of videos for you this year so that you can watch this whole thing progress. But what I want to talk to you about is making a beautiful vegetable garden. And this is specific to raised beds, although many of these principles apply to in-ground gardening as well. So there are some really good reasons why the traditional way to plant a vegetable garden is in rows. And those mostly involve weeds and just creating the right spacing between plants. So if you're planting in rows, you know what's ever outside the rows is a weed, and because they're planted in rows, it's very easy to get in there with a hoe or whatever method. Actually, in some in-ground beds, some people would just till between those two rows. So it's very easy to manage weeds. Well, weeds are not as much of an issue in raised bed gardens, so that consideration isn't one you really have to worry about too much, which means we are open to many different ways to create beautiful garden beds. So my goal is to create garden beds that are beautiful to look at, but just as productive as any other vegetable or edible garden. And the main way I do that is by thinking about pattern. So if you dispense with this idea that everything has to be planted in a row, you start getting the idea that you can do many different things. So the other reason to think about going outside the box and not doing your standard rows in your garden and really shaking things up is because you're adding diversity to your vegetable garden, which has an incredible amount of benefits. And if you're interested in finding more about that, I highly recommend Jessica Walliser's new book called Plant Partners, which is a science-based approach to companion planting. But the general concept here is that diversity in a garden has a host of benefits, particularly when it comes to pests, to be honest. But also there are other things too. And keep in mind that many of the things that we're talking about are also edible. So you can still have an entirely edible garden that is equally beautiful and full of flowers, and everything in it is still edible. So let me walk you through a couple of different ways that you could approach designing your vegetable beds.
So the easiest way to think about this is think in terms of different shapes and different designs and what you can do with them with textures and color. So a great place to start is with greens. So think about lettuces and kale and chard, things like that. And that's where you can play with color and pattern. So instead of planting things in rows, what if you planted things in, say, like a brick pattern or a checkerboard pattern? So you can use red lettuces and green lettuces and multiple varieties of them and plant each of those in blocks to create a checkerboard pattern. Now, if you want to get more creative, start thinking about maybe you still want to do stripes, which are kind of like rows, but you want to change it up a little bit more. So let's say you do a row of green lettuces, followed by a row of red lettuces, and then maybe in the middle you change it up by doing like a Swiss chard. My favorite by far is Swiss chard Bright Lights, which has these beautiful stems on it. And then you could hit that with another red lettuce of a different variety and then another green lettuce. Or maybe you want to make this more dynamic and think about going at an angle. And maybe in this case, you incorporate something like green lettuces, red lettuces, And then here you could put in some kale, that beautiful, and it's nice and tall in the middle, so it's not going to shade anything else out. It's got that kind of, that lacinato kale, which I love, has that kind of blue foliage. And then in the corners, you can do like a mesclun mix, which is a cut and come again type thing. This is also a place where you could mix in more of that Swiss chard or whatever kind of greens you like. But the idea is that you can play with color and texture. And what's nice about these things is that you can still pick these while they are growing and you'll still maintain that same pattern. Now, I'm thinking about doing sort of an herb bed, and you can use for a framework, think about something that will almost create the effect of a hedge. So I'm thinking about something like a dwarf basil that really bulks up. It creates almost like a little, almost imagine like a mini boxwood hedge sort of look. But you could do something like chives would work really good in this case. I actually have a chive hedge in my circle garden and it works great. Just remember that chives are a perennial, so those will be there forever until you dig them out. And then inside those diamonds that I'm creating, I'm thinking about creating a great pattern of basil because I can eat basil all day long. So I could put in my favorite Emerald Towers basil and then do a purple basil in the center. And in the next one, I could do the reverse. And then in all these little sort of nooks and crannies, I could put in my other herbs. I could do rosemary in one and thyme in one. And then we could incorporate a flower, say some nasturtiums in those two, which are great for all sorts of beneficial insects as well as being edible. And then I could put dill in one corner and parsley in the other. And then at the end of this bed, I'm planning on growing cucumbers, so there's plenty of room for that at the end of this bed as well, and all those other plants will be beneficial to growing that basil, and the whole thing will work in concert with each other. All right, so let's get on to planting a couple of these things ahead of time so that it's a little bit easier to plant out our patterns later on.
So it is helpful when you're doing some of these designs to actually grow your plants and start some of your plants ahead of time because it's much easier to lay things out. And then you don't have to worry about something germinating and something else not germinating. So for the plants that it's appropriate to start early inside, I feel like that's helpful in this case. So for my basil-centric bed, certainly I will need a lot of basil for that. So two of the basils that are going to feature prominently in this are, as I talked about, Everleaf, Emerald Towers, and then Crimson King. Now, I grew Everleaf, Emerald Towers last year, actually 2 years in a row now, but I do believe this to be the best basil I have ever grown. It's actually not specifically downy mildew, bred to be downy mildew resistant, but because it grows very tall, it moves around in the air, and I think it's the airflow that helps that stay resistant from that downy mildew that can be a problem with other basils. And then the other one is Crimson King because I thought a dark leaf basil would be so interesting in that design. So I'm approaching how I start some things a little bit differently this year because last year I got caught up in so much potting on, and that is extremely time consuming. So in the cases where I think plants will never get too big, I'm starting in sort of a moderate sized pot. So this is just a 2-inch pot, and I'm gonna start my basil in these. I think what's even more important than the 2 inches is that it's relatively deep, so there's plenty of room for those roots to grow. So my goal here is to start the seeds in here and never move them on, which saves me a step, and I'll be able, since I'm growing so much basil, I will be able to grow it easily in a smaller space. And I think the basil will be just fine in that situation. Generally, you can plant your basil out at the same time you plant your tomatoes out. You do want warm soil. Basil is not going to be happy in the cold, so don't even let it get depressed by pushing it hard. Just wait until it's warm enough before you plant it out, which for me is usually about 2 or sometimes even 3 weeks after my last frost. So just keep that in mind that when you're using that last frost date, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the date you're going to actually be planting them out in the garden. Now, you know, I always talk about using a seed starting mix. Junk Seed does have their own. It's very nice. I used it last year. And I think by now you guys know the general drill on this. Of course, you always want to check your seed packets because they're going to tell you everything you need to know. So this tells you right away, start your seed 6 to 8 weeks, which we already talked about, in a sterile starting mix, which this is. And just pay attention to the depth, 1/8 to 1/4 inch. Now listen, I don't measure these things out. I just eyeball, which is certainly adequate. And I will plant probably 2 seeds per pot here, with the eye to thinning one of them out. Now you can either make a little depression and stick your seed in there, or you can put more soil over the top. It doesn't matter. I'll probably just do a little depression. I'll probably just make a little depression and pop that seed in there, and then just sort of lightly cover it. If you're planting a whole tray of it, obviously you only need 1 label. So when it comes to lettuce, you can actually direct sow these or start them ahead of time. I am going to start some of the heading lettuces ahead of time because it will be easier for me to place those where I want them to, but you don't need pots nearly as big as what we're doing for this basil for that. For that, you can use any sort of small cell pack type thing, maybe even 1.5 inches, be more than enough. 1 inch should be fine too, because you don't want big plants. You're only going to have little lettuce plants that are about this big, because they will bulk up and they're not going to be super happy growing in these cells. They'll be much happier once you get them out in the garden. Now those you're going to start about 4 weeks ahead of your last frost, and then you'll be able to get those out right away because those are just fine with a little bit cooler temperature. Now things like this one, this is baby leaf zesty mesclun mix, which is a fabulous lettuce for salads. I would not start this ahead of time, frankly. Early, I think with these loose leaves, the beauty of it is that you're just gonna sprinkle those seeds. And so that's why I'm sort of designing those for more open spaces, because you're never gonna be able to place specific plants in that case. So something like that, I will just direct seed, although there are instructions on here to start indoors early if you want to do that. Things like kale, same thing. You can go either way with it. In the case of a specific design, you might want to start some plants so that you've got those ready to go, but you can certainly direct sow that. And then with beautiful Swiss chard, definitely just And then with beautiful Swiss chard, just direct sow that one. The seeds are big. They're easy to grow that way. And again, it's not something where you're going to be able to line up those plants perfectly. And if you want to, you can just, after they germinate, you just thin out the ones that you don't want to have be there. And then lastly, nasturtiums, such a key flower in my garden for so long. You do want to soak these seeds a little bit. I only soak them for about 3 hours in warm water. You can over soak seeds. That'll help soften that seed coat. These are nice big seeds. Have your kids help you with these because they're easy for kids to handle, these seeds. This is what the seeds look like. They're about the size of a pea. Nice and easy for kids to help with. And these just plant those out directly into the garden. I have started them in pots ahead of time, but I usually do that when I'm growing them in containers or something like that. So for the most part, I've decided just to save myself a step to just plant them out directly. They germinate quickly and they get going quite quickly as well. So anything you're starting from seed early, you are gonna wanna put under a grow light. You can try a really sunny window, but it's tough with that. So especially if you're trying to start a whole bunch of basil, this is a situation where grow lights are really your friend. Something like the basil is going to really want some bottom heat. So until they germinate, you can just put them on top of a refrigerator or a radiator, not like boiling hot radiator, but a radiator, something with a little bit of warmth to it, because it doesn't need light until it germinates. Then you move it under your lights. In the case of things like lettuce and kale, these are things that don't need that heat, so you don't have to have any sort of bottom heat for those to get germinating. In fact, they'll appreciate being grown on a little bit cooler. So I think you can see that really your only limitation here is your imagination and what you like. Now, it's important to remember that we don't want to sacrifice design for productivity because this is a vegetable garden. We do want it to be productive. So when you're making your plant selections, just remember, do plant things that you intend to eat, or if you can't eat them, at least somebody will eat them. You don't want to let anything go to waste in a vegetable garden. And then also remember that a great design feature in any vegetable garden, including raised bed gardens, can be adding structures to them. So I add bamboo teepees to grow sweet peas up in the beds that I use typically just for cut flowers. I have other structures to grow peas and beans and cucumbers up. Some people have made beautiful cattle panel or hog panel arches that they grow peas all the way around or beans all the way around, and they make a tunnel, which is just interesting and kind of private and secret and lovely and really special for kids. Also a very good way to grow it because the fruit hangs down. It's very easy to pick. So get a little creative with your vegetable garden this year and try to make it a space that you think is just as beautiful as it is important and productive for providing food for you and your family and your friends.
Yesterday, there was sun and there